friends, welcome to episode 146 of Storyteller Conclave. This is a show all about helping you run the best tabletop role-playing game that you can, whether you're a new storyteller or dungeon master learning the craft, or an experienced storyteller looking to take your game to the next level. I'm Sarah.
I'm Rob.
How are we doing, Rob?
I am trying to, wow, my phone just went nuts, because I had Mixlr coming up, and it was now being stupid on me.
Oh, is that mine or yours?
That's mine, unfortunately,
so
give me a second here.
I can't hear it.
I'm going to try and see if I can do this without it echoing into you guys right now.
Alright, well, anyway, technical difficulties aside, thank you for joining us for episode 146. News for us from a role-playing standpoint. You want to just kill them?
I'm working on it. I'm getting the double echo. I'm sorry, folks. Hang on a second.
Anyhow, a gaming note. We had Mouse Guard last weekend. Mouse Guard, we had the winter session of Mouse Guard, and winter session kind of goes a little bit differently than the normal everyday sessions. It's kind of a camp down. You play in the same location and do like some maintenance, some character upgrades and whatnot and such like that. It was a lot of fun. So a big shout out to the Mad Elf, who oftentimes sends in questions for us for telling an amazing story. We got the first year of that campaign done.
Yes. I'm sorry about that. Yes, it was pretty amazing. I love how everything worked out with that. One of my favorite parts is always that we do have like a player session, and this kind of felt like an extended player session.
Yeah.
With just a little bit of guidance to it. And it was funny because it was like the mechanics of Mouse Guard, of what you have to do during the winter session, like a procedural thing. Like, imagine if leveling up in D&D was a game session.
Yeah.
And it was really fun, honestly.
It was very cool.
It was nice to move through it in the way that we did, but the game is exceptionally narrative, so it just fit. It felt natural, so.
We're also going to have a new player joining our game.
We do.
So a big shout out to Wendy.
Yes, I hope I'm sure she will fit in just fine. She's had some terrible gaming experiences, which has kept her from doing gaming, and she's been very ginger about stepping back into the gaming light.
But I'm really hoping this is going to be a good experience for her.
Very much so.
I always hate hearing those stories about like, oh, I played one time and it was such a crappy experience that I can't do it anymore, you know? So it just breaks my heart, and I absolutely really just hope beyond hope that Wendy has a great time with us. My game's coming up next weekend.
Yes. Or this upcoming.
This upcoming weekend.
Yes.
Yeah, in like 3 days or whatever.
Yep.
So I'm working on last minute game prep. Got a last minute mini painted for you guys.
Yep.
Cramming the rules like it's finals week.
But again, it's Suede.
Yeah, it's Suede, but there's some rules we haven't dabbled in yet. That I want to make sure that I have more or less down so that I can officiate them with some sort of confidence. So
yeah.
But so I'm super excited about that. It seemed like everybody else was super excited about that too. So
Okay, we'll get to the show topic. Our live chat is asking. So tonight's show topic is we're talking about violence in stories, or grit and violence in stories.
Yeah. And it's funny because a lot of the games that we play are already very violent.
Yeah.
But I'm just kind of a base level, right? Like, you crack open any role-playing game, and probably the thickest chapter in there is the combat chapter.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
In most games, and I was thinking back, and I'm like, I think Apelion, a dragon story, was the only game that did not have, like, a robust combat system.
Not at all. So, and even games that, reference combat on a lighter scale, like Powered by the Apocalypse games, where it's a move. It's not descriptive. Like, it's not giving you individual tactics or things like that.
Physically is like what the name of the move.
Give it all kind of a thing. You know, those types of things where you're using terms versus actual actions or approaches. Or combat approaches. It's still a portion. It's still there kind of directing it, because ever since the beginning of tabletop role-playing, that has been the key action. That's what defines what you're doing.
It kind of started as a war game, and then moved into role-playing after that.
Yep.
You know? So we got kind of thinking, and it's like we talk about how to use mystery as a dramatic tool, and how to use romance as a dramatic tool, and but then there's this ever-present violence.
Yeah.
How do you use violence as a dramatic tool? What sort of nuance can you add to it? And what do you do? Is there a way to have a sort of violent and gritty game that expresses more of a horror aspect, maybe a deep survival aspect, that is compelling and fun to play, that isn't just revolting.
Exactly. I mean, and we kind of came at this at the angle of like, are we talking about grit as something that goes with violence or separated? How do they go hand in hand? Because they often do. Yeah,
they often do. And I think it's kind of a cause and effect thing. I think grit begets violence. You can have heroic violence, but I think grit opens the door a lot more to it.
Well, I think it changes the tone, definitely.
It changes the tone a lot more. So let's talk quickly about definitions here.
Sure, at least for this show, yeah.
We always open with definitions of the things we're talking about. So what do we mean by violence? Because violence is a pretty pointed word. So when we're talking about violence here, we're talking about it as a narrative thing. There's violence as an act, okay? A thing that happens that is violent, okay? Someone gets harmed, someone gets killed. Like, there's a difference killing in combat is violent, but, like, there's a distinct tonal difference between that and, like, murdering somebody.
Yeah, 7th Sea does an interesting job of talking about duels and bloodshed, and killing is not something you do in a duel. That is a very specific thing, and it is outlawed because gentlemen don't duel to the death.
Yeah.
And pistols aren't allowed because of how dangerous they are, but when they are allowed, it is to first blood regardless of what happens. And, so when you start moving into these moments where, even if you're fighting thugs, you're fighting the rumpties of the henchmen or even the villain, you're not killing them. You're knocking them out. You're tagging them, cutting them slightly, basically wounding them in such a way that they don't want to continue. And that's where it's left off. So it's not a violent act. It is, to a degree. It's definitely harmful. It's combat.
It's violence, but it's not like violence.
Right. And the way that I saw
it's
a
not
good
carnage.
Yeah. In the case of combat, when you're watching a movie and you see a battlefield, where people are fighting each other and then it moves on from there, versus, and you see guards coming back and they're injured and things like that, and you're like, okay, well I know the flavor of this. Versus you see a battlefield and you see people literally walking around with spears stabbing the wounded on the ground.
Yeah.
To make sure they're dead well after the battle is over. They've won, clearly. And now they're literally just walking around murdering people. There's a tone change.
Oh, there absolutely is, yeah.
Like that is a tonal shift to, this is violence.
And I'm glad you brought up a wartime setting like that too, because I think that's another kind of narrative angle to violence, and that is violence as a state of being. So take really any like wartime story. I'm sure all of us have seen at least one, Band of Brothers or Saving Private Ryan that take place during World War II. And there, I mean, even if the story does not touch on the events of World War II, you still have violence as a state of being. It's a backdrop to the story. You can tell that everybody's got that little bit of trauma behind their eyes. Everybody knows someone who's lost someone in the war. Their whole lives have been disrupted because of the fear and violence and upheaval and stuff like that. And so even if you never see a single bomb drop or a single gun be shot, you still have violence interacting with the story in a very significant way and changing the whole tone of it.
Yeah. And it's in that sense as well, we also then have grit, which when we're talking about grit, we're talking about a step towards reality. I'm going to screw it up again. Verisimilitude.
Verisimilitude.
I get close, but I'm never great with it. Where we're breaking that down even closer to reality, where heroics is starting to step out. And I use the term heroics in the hero act, not so much that you have people who are doing great things or noble things or stuff like that, saving someone, but there's less of that. You see that everything has a consequence. There's a guy who's fallen out in a road who's being pinned down, and you go to get him. It is way more dangerous, and therefore that act of doing that and seeing that becomes excessively heroic.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that there's not magic, and it just means that the characters that you're witnessing within that are fragile.
Yes.
They are breakable. They will fold.
They're no, and this is what we mean by no less heroics, is they're no greater than your average Joe.
Yeah.
They're just a dude.
Yeah.
And they have the same. They don't have plot armor. They're nobody special. They're not a hero class. They're not 17th level or whatever. They're just
bullet spongy whatever.
Nope.
Yeah. Not happening.
Sting them with a bee. They hurt.
So it kind of begs to ask the question, why?
Yeah, and this was I think kind of the big thing. Like both of you and I think had a little trouble approaching this topic when we sat down to actually write the sheet.
Mm-hmm.
At least I did, because it was like we realized very quickly that when we were like, let's talk about violent and gritty stories, it's like neither of us run violent or gritty stories.
I mean, we have violence, but we don't have it in the sense that we're discussing here.
Right. I think both of us have a limit where we're like, I don't want to experience that. The world is grim enough already that there's a lot of stuff we can just kind of gloss over. I want to feel like the hero. I don't want to feel like I want to feel like the predator, not the prey.
Right. Or that you're making a difference and turning the light level up a little bit,
exactly.
The hope level in the world up a little bit. And I think that's the thing that we're talking about, is that when you're doing something with either grit or violence that includes it, you're talking about setting expectations, setting the stakes, setting the tone of the whole story. When you start an adventure with something tragic, and that tragedy is something that's palpable, that you set the tone to the piece of, is this piece going to be hopeful? Are we coming up out of the dirt and the dust of a destructive event? Or are we pressing ourselves into it? Is now the change, meaning maybe the characters have gotten so far, they've acquired something, and then something terrible happens. The bomb goes off.
Yeah.
And now the world is a very different place.
Yeah.
Now you're fighting a different transition. We talk about Division all the time. Division starts with a heavy tone.
Oh, it really does. Yeah.
The world is already in a terrible state. It's in chaos, and it's falling to pieces.
For those not familiar, the game The Division by Ubisoft, it takes place in a world where somebody has created a genetically engineered smallpox virus, basically, called the Green Poison, and on Black Friday spreads it onto a bunch of dollar bills. And so they call it the dollar flu. And goes around New York City and just spends a bunch of money. And gets a lot of people to touch those dollars, and by Christmas,
it's spread across
90% of New York City is dead.
Yep, and it's starting to spread across the country, and they finally figure out what caused it. So banks are shut down. Everything is starting to close and fall apart.
It's post-apocalyptic, honestly.
It spreads to DC.
Yeah,
it spreads all along the coast. I mean, just like you'd think it would.
The whole government falls apart. I mean, everything. Just it's a post-apocalyptic story, basically. And so it starts out very, very That's not even the first events of the story. That's literally of the game. That's literally the prologue.
Yeah, it's the prologue.
That's the opening crawl of the game.
Yeah, I mean, Fallout does the same thing. Puts you right in it, but it gives you the stages of what happens.
Yeah.
It makes a hard move right at the beginning
or never changes.
That's right. And it's stories like that where you have a relatively light moment, but has this overtone of that something terrible is about to happen, and then suddenly there's a hard move that takes you into that darkness.
Yeah.
And now you're there. So this is where we're talking about having a dark shadow means that you can have brighter moments. Now you can have joyful moments, and victories are palpable.
Exactly.
And they're proportional to a threat that may not seem on its surface, if you planned it into another scenario, all that bad. But it's like a couple of dogs come across your characters that are vicious, and you have to fight them off, and you're like, well, that doesn't seem like a big deal in D&D normally. It is, except for you don't have any weapons. You're level 1 characters with barely any skill, and you have to fight off rabid dogs.
The one that I was keep coming to is when I was playing Skyrim with all the realism mods in it and stuff like that.
Yep.
And just trying to make it from Winterhold to Windhelm in a snowstorm.
Without dying.
From
the frost.
And I'm like, that doesn't sound like an interesting thing, trying to walk from point A to point B. But like when you have to use all of your resources and all of your wits, and you get attacked by a pack of wolves, which would ordinarily be a couple swings of your sword and a spell, and you're done, and you move right on like it never happened. When suddenly you're looking at that going, I can't afford to fight them because I can't, if I stay out in this weather any longer, I'm going to freeze to death. They represent stalling me long enough that exposure will set in, And then that's when it starts to be, really exciting for you. And it's another reason why, like, I get the same sort of excitement out of Dark Souls.
Yeah.
Is when the threat is real, the victory of overcoming that threat is also very real. And feels amazing.
Yeah, it's a change of scope, really is what it is. No different than Mouse-Guard changes scope, just done to a different light. It doesn't have to be post-apocalyptic for it to be gritty. It doesn't. Scarcity is something that exists in any world, and it doesn't, so, in D&D you can have scarcity. You can have limited resources without it being tragic. So the thing is grit can occur without it being a horrific, violent situation, but it doesn't mean that it won't feel dangerous, because it can very easily feel dangerous. I've talked to a couple of different people online about games that they've ran for several years where their players don't get above level 5. They just level once per year.
Yeah.
And the game is incredible because you're eking by. It feels real.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And in that, it's you can definitely set a different feel for everyone. And again, that challenge feels better when you succeed.
I had a D&D game back in the day when it was 3rd edition, and you remember in the 3rd edition Dungeon Master's Guide they had NPC classes?
Yes.
It was like adept and like fighter. They weren't warrior, they were fighter, or whatever the other one was,
Yep.
And mage or something like that. So I started all of my characters out as NPC classes.
Okay.
And they had like 6 hit points.
Yeah.
And I got them involved in this little mystery. There was basically a necromancer that was working in the city and was killing off criminals. And animating them and using them to kill other criminals and stuff like that. And the police were kind of turning a blind eye because, sure, he's a necromancer, but like, he's kind of doing our job for us. Crime rate's never been better in the city, Yeah. So let's not work too hard at catching him,
Right.
But then, of course, that line of, like, who's a criminal and who's not starts getting drawn a little shorter and a little shorter, and starts realizing that maybe letting a necromancer run rampant in your city is not the greatest idea. And so our little detective gumshoes with their 6 hit points got involved, and, like, I forgot for, like, a hot second that's, the power level we were dealing with, and, so they stumbled upon one of his little safe houses, and like a zombie hit one of my characters once
and killed them.
No, but it was enough to make him go, that was 2/3 of my hit points on that D4 damage. And I went, oh, wow. Okay, and they were like, retreat, from a single like challenge rating 1/8 zombie, and it changed the tone. It really, really changed the tone.
Yeah.
When suddenly you're that fragile, when you're not a bullet sponge, a big bucket of hit points to throw at things. You know?
I think the other aspect that I saw was somebody had taken people, they'd created their characters, their classes and everything.
Uh-huh.
He then started them off in a lab. They all had they'd all been captured in different places.
Okay.
You know, related to their backstories. And wake up in a lab feeling odd, not comfortable, like their bodies are sick. And they're in these cages, and there's this mad scientist who's getting his butt kicked by some other adventurers, and they're just left there after this guy gets taken out and they leave, and so they have to escape, right? Well, they quickly figure out that they've all been transferred into creatures, monsters.
Ew.
Their minds. So they're all different CR rating less than 1 monsters. Creatures.
So it's the video for Where's Your Head At by Basement Jacks.
Yeah, kinda. Yeah. And so they can't really communicate except for one of them, who is a druid. And they all have their skills, but they don't have their abilities, they don't have their armor, they don't have their weapons. But they find some of that stuff, and now they have to go find these adventurers who took this scientist who had been doing experience to try and figure out how to get their bodies back. And now that's the whole first adventure of like, and then why did he do it?
Yeah.
And like figure all that out. And so, but they're monsters. So they can't just walk into a tavern and do stuff. They have to figure their way through things.
And there's also a lot of like body horror going on there. Like, the trans woman in me who like experiences body dysphoria, you know, is just thinking about that going like, oh, in the wrong body and feel like a monster, huh? Yeah, okay. That feels familiar.
So it again, that takes that and it puts a little bit of the realism on its head, but it actually adds a lot of grit and horror and violence. You know, when, you know, they're staying in a barn and that farmer comes out with a pitchfork.
Yeah.
You know, and then finds them.
The whole world is instantly set against you. And
seals them in the barn because he's going to go get the guard to get rid of them.
Right.
You know, kind of a thing. So it helps set a tone and a feel and sets a perspective on the world, I think. So that your lens that you're viewing things with this new kind of feel suddenly now changes perspective. And I think that's one of the keys that Grit and Violence does, is that it quickly throws that optic in front of you.
Oh yeah.
Sometimes staring at you as a mirror, but other times this is the world. So, I mean, the good question, that's the thing we talk about all the time, is getting this to the table. How do you where do we get consent?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what is, because consent is the key.
You're not gonna just drop this on your group and just be like, hey, by the way, this guy gets eviscerated in front of you and start describing it, you know.
You kind of got to know what you're expecting as you're going into something.
Yeah.
And shows do this all the time. They don't usually just open with rampant, disregard for gore and things unless they're a, grindhouse and you know what you're getting into.
This show depicts scenes of graphic violence. The viewer discretion is advised.
The difference is you don't get to tell your table. You need to negotiate that.
Yeah.
It's a combined story. And I think that's one of the things that I read as a biggest failure among storytellers out there, where they're like, well, my players, I brought in this kind of stuff and they just don't seem to like it. I keep losing players. And they're like, did you ever ask them if they wanted this level of gore?
Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to tell a story and like,
right, but is it the story they want to hear?
Right, are you cramming it down their throat?
Yeah.
Eat the story regardless of how it tastes?
Like, storytelling is in a sense, though it is an interactive media, it's very much in a sense like watching Netflix,
Yeah.
Or like watching anything on YouTube. If it's not something you want to experience, you change the channel. You press stop and you move to something different, and it's no different than that. If you're telling me a story I don't want to be a part of, I'm going to move to a different table.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's, I look at it as the one that got me was a storyteller was trying to tell a story that was, dark space opera.
Okay.
And I was like, okay. And he was explaining out everything, and everybody's just like, so your players expected this to be like Dark Star Wars from your description that you put up there, and you ran Warhammer 40K or Aliens. Like, that's very, but he's like, but that's dark opera. And like, but you didn't say that. You didn't say that, power armored dudes are going to show up with chain swords.
Yeah.
And then you're going to describe in great detail how as they come out in their blood-soaked armor with skulls mounted to their shoulders and their chain swords ripping and screaming blood for the blood god.
Like opera to me.
That does not feel like opera at all.
That feels like space horror.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so he was just like, oh, no, it's just gore, and it's, no, that's not. That's a different feel.
A whole different tone, yeah.
So you drop the ball on that. And so it's always like, if you need to put it in, like if this is not the theme of your story, but it is a theme of a section, maybe an adventure, maybe a specific event that's going on, you want to kind of preface it to people. You want to make sure that, like, hey, you don't have to tell them what the events are about to be, but you can say, like you did, hey, how do you guys feel about kids being involved in combat? And we were all like, I think if it's important for the story, I think we can get around that psychologically, depending on but like acts of violence against them, can you kind of handle that with like a fade or something?
Yeah. The kids were given armor and crossbows essentially and shoved forward and basically told like, go get them.
Yeah. And I think
you guys ended up rescuing the kids and it was great.
Yeah. But like, to open a scene with the impaling of a child is not
never.
But you knew that was off the table.
Oh yeah,
instantaneously.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's reading your table, but you can't read the table until you present something to them.
Exactly. And it's better, like, I know we all live in the spoiler culture where it's like, oh, don't tell me anything. I don't want anything spoiled. But like, it's better to tip your hand a little bit and get consent beforehand than to just drop something on them and have somebody X-card your entire scene and then walk away and be like, I can't believe you would do that.
Like, or just be unprepared for somebody to say, can you please dial it back? And you're like, I can't because this is part of the story.
The important thing to remember about the impact of violence in stories is that the impact of violence is trauma. Okay, that is what you get from violence. You get trauma. Now, role-playing games are largely here to experience things safely in a storytelling environment that we can't experience safely in real life. I am not going to go out and start, chopping away at, I don't know, we really don't have monsters in real life or anything like that, but like, I'm not going to grab a sword and go on a killing spree in real life, you know? But I can experience the excitement of that. I can experience a story where I can do that at the table with some dice and some friends.
Yeah.
But you can't forget that you are experiencing it a little bit. It's very filtered through the aspect of storytelling, but you are experiencing it. And the impact of violence is trauma. And so, technically, the more violent you make your games, the more you are legitimately traumatizing your players.
Correct.
Just a little. Just a tiny little bit. You're giving them that fear response, that fight or flight response. You're making them feel the thrill of the danger behind it and such like that. And I mean, I'm not saying you're harming your players. But that is the outcome, and you need to understand that, and that outcome will be proportional to how much you put it in there and how much buy-in your players have to agree to it and accept it and process it.
And be able to manage it. It is one of the things that I think it was on a TED Talk that I watched, was the fact that the difference between role-playing and realism is almost nothing. And the reason being is because when we sit down at a table versus walking around in reality, we are building the same neurons. Like, there's no difference in the experience set that we're doing, except for the fact that instead of visually through my cortex and through my ear hearing the exact event as it is occurring before me, I am literally creatively building those images from a series of events that have happened in my life because I need to imagine what I'm experiencing.
Yeah.
I'm an active participant in the creation of this memory. If I'm not prepared for what I'm about to witness or feel, there is no difference in the trauma or in how it's going to connect with my personal past or events that have occurred in my existence.
Yes. Yes.
There is
100%.
no doubt you will experience trauma. And that's one of the things that you really have to get across in your mind as a storyteller is that no matter what you're writing, you have the chance to create triggers and trauma. And specifically with gritty, violent acts, you should be doubly concerned about putting those into something without having consent. It is more dangerous in most cases because it is something that many people are involved with. I can remember a number of stories that I read about veterans coming back and being unable to play games like D&D.
Yeah. Yeah, I can absolutely imagine.
Because a storyteller talked about someone getting stabbed by a rogue, and they were like, "No, I'm sorry, guys, I gotta go." And they were like, "What's the problem?" And he's just like, "I can't handle that." Yeah,
I know what that's like.
I know the
like
sound.
In real life. Yeah.
They're like, "Sorry, I'm done." And that's a thing you have to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so you're going to add. You've talked to your group. You've got consent to run a darker, grittier, more violent group, things like that. So let's assume you do have the buy-in from your players. How do you go about adding the gritty feel to your game? Like, where's the tone? What are we looking for in how we're going to portray the story to make it feel gritty?
So my first lean-in is that we're talking about a little bit more realism. Now, realism is a hard thing to kind of imagine because it's a very widespread.
Right.
Like,
so
what are we talking about with realism? And
verisimilitude is really what we're talking about, where it feels real within the scope of the reality that you've set forth.
Correct. And I think the first thing that's the easiest way, and I say the easiest way but it's not based on the system, because if your system doesn't allow for it to be this kind of thing, is that peril needs to be the norm. People are fragile. Those are one of the easiest ways you can bring something close to reality is remove the heroic, I can handle anything.
Yep.
If that fear is there, that the one thing that you didn't think could be taken away from you can be, now we have a problem.
Yeah, this is one of the big reasons why, I like Savage Worlds a lot better than Dungeons and Dragons as far as, how combat feels to me. So I think we've all seen this happen at a D&D table where someone does the math and they go, "Oh, it's just a goblin with a spear. I'm a 11th level fighter. All he can do is a D4 plus probably 2 damage or something like that to me, and I have 98 hit points. Like, what is he going to do to me? He physically can't kill me in under a minute.
Right.
So I'm just going to stand here and take it."
Yeah.
Now, you take that in Savage Worlds, and that little goblin rolls his fighting skill, aces a couple times, rolls a 37 on damage, and you take 4 wounds, you can't soak them, you're dead. That's it. I don't care if you're a legendary, advanced character or not, you have the same 4 wounds as everybody else.
Yeah.
And the power curve is flattened as such that you're, you can't out-level danger.
One of the things that I did read that I thought was a great modification for D&D to make grit feel real was enemy criticals. If an enemy crits on you, you lose a point of constitution. Your con goes down by 1 because you've taken a critical wound to your body.
Oh my. I don't know how I feel about that off the top of my head, but
it was, the idea was where you decide how that, however it hits you, that thing so even a goblin with just a wooden stick could crit on you and cause severe damage to your body. Enough that it left a scar.
Yeah.
A wound to your constitution. And I'm sorry, if you ain't got a lot of con, I mean, even some of the finest players, what do you do? Take 20 crits? You're out of the game.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know? But you start thinking about combat in a very different way in D&D the moment you realize that.
Do we want to risk doing this? Because there's a 1 in 5 chance that I don't walk out of this a whole person, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a very simple change that you're like, what? Because in most cases, if you crit on something, there's a good chance it's probably dead.
Yeah.
But why isn't it the other way around? And the answer is, it can be.
Well, because there's an assumption that you're the heroes, but if you're playing a gritty game, you're just as squishy as everybody else, and those rules should apply to you as well.
So that bodily harm is a thing.
Yeah.
Like, whether it's in the mechanics or it's something you apply to the mechanics like this, it is definitely something where it's like, yeah, you're worried about travel. Like, yeah, maybe you won't take the mountainside rough terrain up, because if you slip on the hill, you're not just taking some hit points. You've got a broken leg. You're now moving at half speed. You're now a risk.
And especially if you're playing a gritty game, healing may not be right around the corner.
Exactly.
A broken leg may put your character out of commission for a month.
Yeah.
Of bed rest while you heal.
Yep.
And that's if you can make it back to shelter and don't die of exposure out in the,
exactly,
out in the wilds. It starts turning into Bear Grylls,
Well, I mean, and that brings up resources.
Yeah.
Having consumed resources. Now that
food,
backpack
water,
full of gear that is listed on your character sheet, if you stick to that gear list and you check those boxes off and suddenly it's, day 7 of your journey and you're out of food, you're in the winter wild, there's no animals about, your survival skill is not getting you through, do you start taking points of exhaustion?
Yeah.
And then eventually start taking damage?
Yes, you do.
Again, that's that thing that keeps ticking down. And, like I said, with the crit modifier, suddenly a goblin is super dangerous.
Yeah.
You're out there hungry, fatigued, so you're at disadvantage, and suddenly out of a cave, you see a cave, you're like, oh, let's go there. Like, we can get some shelter. You go in and there's 7 goblins. 2 of them are guards with armor, and you're like, they're fed and armored. We're screwed.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, that's the whole thing. So,
it can be exciting, but it can also be very draining.
Yes.
To be constantly on guard for
right.
everything all the time.
Exactly. And I think that's where games like Dread do a good job of giving you a splash of it.
Yeah.
Your role is where the concern is. The rest of us just telling a story, and then we're gonna have you pull a block, and you're suddenly, and your heart rate goes back up. Now it's not every combat.
Yeah.
Or every encounter. It's just when it's necessary.
Exactly.
So I think that's also part of that grit, is knowing at what layer your players consent to it, and how much you're going to apply it, what level of force you're going to apply to that.
Yeah, there's definitely a level of grit where it turns from gritty and realistic, where we have to worry about constant peril, to survival realism simulator,
aka crunchy, super
crunchy. You and some friends were playing that game Scum. And it's you can't eat the same type of food, or because you don't have to have the right nutrients in your body, and that means your stamina won't regenerate.
Yeah, it's all kinds of itty.
Keep your salt levels and your sugar levels even on this handy graph, and I'm like, this is exhausting.
Yeah, it's suddenly charts and flow, and it's it's too much. It's too much.
Way too
so
much.
let's step into violence. I don't know why that's but let's step into violence.
That's tiring. Let's get into the violence.
So when we're talking about violence, we're not just talking about adding gore. Grindhouse, anybody can do grindhouse gore. And in some cases, if you just add gore to something, all you're doing is making it comical at a certain point. Literally, you step in and just splash blood against the wall, and people just start...
head off, and a big gout of blood, you get the Kurosawa film effect,
or everybody just starts laughing because it's spurt, 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 and it's just filling the room with blood, and you're like, oh god, this is dumb.
You gotta go with the high pressure power washer nozzle of blood from the Kurosawa films, man. That's my favorite.
Exactly. So, you already have the violence. It's already out there. Everyone's got that. what is it when we're talking about violence or a violent act being something that is meaningful to the story?
So for me, like, the big thing that I think of, like, acts of violence, used tastefully in a story is, we've started using this term a lot. So I want to just define it one more time in case, people have missed it, is we're talking about a hard move.
Right.
And a hard move is basically when, the storyteller says, this thing happens. Period. There is no player agency that fits into it. There's nothing that could have been done by the players to avoid it. It is something they are doing, they're inserting into the story to change the events that are before you. Usually it spurs the heroes into action.
Yeah.
Or fundamentally changes the battlefield that they're on.
Yeah.
That will make them make their decisions differently from what they were.
The opening of Skyrim when the dragon lands and just starts lighting everything on fire.
Yeah.
Is a hard move. You're not going to fight that dragon.
Yeah, if you're the storyteller telling the opening of Skyrim, you're like, oh yeah, by the way, so this happens, that happens, what do you guys want to do? Well, I'm going to tell the executioner to, get stuffed. Like, okay, cool. Then a dragon lands.
Yeah.
Hard move.
Yeah.
There's nothing you can do to change the fact that dragon's there.
Right.
And it's here now. Deal with it.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is you've got hard moves where, like, the bomb goes off and then the bomb goes off. Like you're all witnessing something and you're expecting, like, oh, the police are going to, handle the situation, and then suddenly the bomb goes off and you watch the lower windows of the first third of the building blow out.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh God. Did that just happen?
There's a really great hard move, a great use of violence as a hard move in Waterdeep Dragon Heist that Sean was running for us for a while.
Yeah, I think we talked about this a little.
And I apologize. This is going to be a brief spoiler, so just put your fingers in your ears for the next 15 seconds and say la la la. Starting now, there's a scene where somebody sets off basically a fireball in the middle of a crowded street. In order to, I believe, cover for something as they're stealing it. And that's kind of what your characters are left with, is just like, oh, by the way, a bunch of broken, bleeding bodies right outside your front door. Bomb just went off.
Yeah.
Have fun. What do you do?
Yeah.
Like, oh my God. I mean, you want to talk about a tonal shift.
Yep.
It was great.
Yeah. And it's things like that where the hard move may not affect the characters directly, but psychologically it changes the scene, it changes the theme. I mean, another great one that you had mentioned here, which I didn't even think about, but is true, is that storms are violent.
Yeah.
Like, you can't stop a storm coming in. I think one of the best parts of some movies that I've seen is when a storm hits in a movie, whether it's a dust storm, whether it's an electrical storm, whether it's you're on the seas and a storm approaches, those types of things are so monumental that they are a hard move within themselves, but they set the tone of the scene. This horrific moment that's about to hit.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's an impending. It creates that stress. I mean, you just talking about it, you're building the tension that eventually is going to happen.
Yeah.
Twister was a great movie for that, is that you could see that something terrible was about to come. And the thing about Twister was you may not have seen, at a distance you're watching this violent act occur, miles and miles away while they're monitoring it and doing their thing. But then they drive through the aftermath.
Yeah, they drive through the town and you see the people trying to pick up the pieces and mourning the lost. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's where those hard moves can make a huge difference, and violence suddenly becomes an important part of the story.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
that said,
yeah,
it totally can be just adding gore.
It totally can be just adding gore.
So the question then, is it going to be graphic? And why is it going to be graphic?
Is that important for it to be graphic?
And maybe the answer is yes. I mean, are you running a horror game?
Yeah.
Are you trying to ramp up terror? Absolutely. Like, putting a point on how viscerally abhorrent these acts of violence are, can be part of that. Like I said, you traumatize your players just a little bit, and when it's consensual, it can be exciting. But when it's not, it's just traumatic.
Yeah.
If you've got that buy-in from your players, by all means, let your descriptive, chops, let them go. And
I presented a traumatic scene within my D&D game. I had presented a character to you who was basically a doppelganger of your character, who was then found dead, clearly murdered.
Yeah.
Without question, left for dead. Mm-hmm. And then you spoke with her to find out what happened, and it was clear the events that occurred. I didn't describe the events, but it was her explaining what had happened. And I didn't have to make it gory. You saw the aftermath and a description from the undead speaking to you about it.
Yes.
And it was enough. I watched the table go dead silent, listening and coming through with all of, in their own mind's eye, what all transpired to make these events. And it presented who that person was to you.
Oh, yeah?
Who that villain was. And made it very real what he was capable of.
Someone I had met for, I think, all of 10 minutes.
If that, yeah.
Essentially, went instantly to the top of my hit list.
Yep. In fact, you actually did not meet him.
Oh, that's right.
He was not there.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. I just have a name.
You just have a name.
I just have a name and a quest.
Yep.
A quest of vengeance.
Yep. But that's the thing, is it's moments like that where it wasn't even a hard movie, it was a discovery.
Yeah.
It was just a scene in a discovery, but it was gory. I left you guys with a horrific aftermath, but again, gory, violent. Mm-hmm. And it was necessary to show what that person was capable of.
And the tragedy of the event, too.
Right.
To really drive it home. If you're just like, oh, she's dead.
Yeah.
It would have been one thing, but you told me how she was dead.
Yeah.
And what must have happened to her.
Right.
And it made me feel insulted for her.
Yes. Yeah.
Of like, how could that have happened to her? Like, it would have been one thing if you just killed her, but like,
right.
There was a certain brutality to it that made me mad.
Yeah.
That such a thing would happen, and the injustice of it.
When we're talking about terror, is another piece that can be put in there that I consider terror to be a step of gore. Alien does a good job of adding terror and gore hand in hand when you see, especially aftermaths or during. One of the things that I always envision is players running, having to evacuate and getting covered by other, people trying to take care of the aliens, and having those aliens have no regard for who those people are to continue moving down corridors.
Oh yeah.
Just eviscerating things, tearing people, throwing them around, piercing their bodies. And that's the thing, is that you're creating this image that whatever is happening to these creatures is meaningless. There's always another, and they're just going to keep coming.
Yeah.
And it's things like that, or the visions that we have from other games where you have this surge of creatures that are coming over, and yeah, they're all getting shot up, but they don't stop. Mm-hmm. And that creates another level of terror that, even though this unbrying gore is going on, it's adding to a different level of heat, if you will, to the meal.
It creates a power disparity, is what it is. It's that you are fearing for your life. Clearly, they are not fearing for their life, and that has created a power disparity between you.
Yeah,
because you are having to reserve things for defense. Mm-hmm. They have no defense, therefore they're all offense, and that's very frightening. That you can't shock them. You can't make them stop. You can't make them see the error of their ways. And that I think is the terror of that situation, and that's excellent.
Yeah. And that's where, there's, especially with gore, is that it goes back into grit a little bit, because now you have those mechanics that are coming out from it, where Traveler has requirements for surgery. Yeah.
You've
got all of these trauma actually in the mechanics. So this is where your violent descriptions start bending into what the game mechanics ask for, and you can use those things pairing, hand in hand, I would say, is to define where we're talking about with violence, is that you may not have to explain the violence or the gore nearly as much if the mechanics are there to help you with it. Mm-hmm. Because now the players have a physical system to follow as well. And have enough of a description so you can tone things back in your descriptions and let the mechanics help carry it through if the players are uncomfortable with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And still have the tension and the concern because the mechanics are there to show it.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Everybody's pulse quickens a little bit when you're making death saving throws.
Exactly.
When you're making that vigor check to see if you see if you die or if you stabilize.
Exactly.
Yep.
So, but there are settings that themes and settings. I'll use that term kind of in a way where it feels violent naturally. Mm-hmm. It's part of where you're putting yourself. War is a perfect reference point for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's again you can't the outcome of violence is trauma, and I think that's one of the great things. I say great things. That sounds really bad of me. But like that's
well-defined things.
One of the narratively interesting things about wartime settings is that you've got an entire generation of people then who share all that trauma in that setting, and it informs everything about how they act and such like that. And it's palpable. It's ever present. It's knitted into the very fabric of the backdrop of the story. And so you can play off of that a lot, and in a lot of subtle ways, it changes how everyone acts, how everyone reacts, what people want, what people are willing to accept.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting narrative tool for shifting just about everything,
Yeah, I agree with that. And in like when you're talking about even in war or moving into war, that's a hard move sometimes to get that violence.
Oh, sure.
The most recent show, Wheel of Time, has that initial Trolloc attack, which is violent.
Oh, yeah.
Horrifically violent. But it is needed to show what the state of the world is becoming. On the
what
cusp
the
of
stakes
things.
are.
Yeah.
And what the stakes are, because you've got these Trollocs that are just killing indiscriminately. Like, I don't care. Like, you find out later that they're well, not much later, literally the end of the first episode, so I'm not spoiling anything here.
Right.
But, you find out that they're looking for basically 4 or 5 people out of that entire village. Screw it, we're just gonna kill everybody.
Yep.
We'll get them eventually.
Yep.
Yep. That's the stakes.
Yeah.
Right there. And they will kill anybody who gets in their way.
Yeah.
To those 4 or 5 people. So,
yep.
You've got that. I think one of the better like hard moves for especially wartime was the Critical Role's second campaign. About 12 episodes into the campaign or so, a war touches off between between Xhorhas and the Dwendalian Empire.
Okay,
and the heroes are just in a city at the time named Zadash, and they're just like at a festival in the Empire and just having a great time, and then like one of the towers explodes and they're like, what is going on? Of course, like, the alarms start going off and guards start getting mobilized, and like the very next day they're like, yeah, we're going to war. That was a bunch of foreign agents that like blew up the tower and stole something valuable and blah 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 blah, and yeah, they're all going to war with Xhorhas now. Okay, and it shifts everything. It goes from we're having fun at a festival to like, you can't find healing potions anymore. They've all been going to the war effort.
Yeah. So we've talked about the hard moves. We've talked about trauma, where you have the natural feelings that when violence comes in, often violence pushes that fight or flight. And so you have a lot more people fleeing. You have a lot more acts going around you. It also sets a tone when your enemies see the same level of violence and they leave. Like, they recognize the violence or are acknowledging the violence. You acknowledge violence in our game with my character. The character causing violence.
Yeah, sure.
And it, again, framed everything very differently and put me on the defensive of, like, my character's a healer.
Yeah, your character also broke somebody's fingers to get information out of them.
I did. I totally did.
And then when that dude turned up at a tavern, having a beer with you a month later, he had some questions.
Yeah.
About your moral bent.
Yeah. Yeah. And about what I was willing to accept and what I wasn't.
Exactly.
So I think that, but I think it also allows players to share in that trauma.
Yeah, it's called trauma bonding.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen it in games.
It's a real life thing. Sharing a traumatic event often bonds survivors together.
Yeah.
It's a real life thing, but it's also like a great plot hook that's good for like your, instead of you all meet in a tavern sort of thing. It's a really great way to do things like, beginning of the game, a super traumatic event happens, and the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker all kind of get caught in the blast wave of that. What are y'all gonna do?
Right.
And since you may not have known each other a minute ago, but you all shared this traumatic experience, and you all don't want that ever to happen to you or anyone else ever again.
Right.
And now suddenly your band of adventurers goes, let's put our heads together and stop that. Hi, I'm the butcher, I'm the baker, I'm the candlestick maker.
Exactly.
And that's how heroes are born.
So, I'm debating on whether or not we should go into our final thoughts or do the questions.
Let's go into the questions, I think.
Because I think we'll get a few things out of this, but I have some thoughts at the end.
We're already running a little long here, so
let's get the questions through.
Sure. All right. So Tim Saucer asks: suppose you have never run a gritty campaign and you want to give it a try. How do you go about conveying this to your group and then setting the tone during your sessions? Specifically, what techniques do you use to prevent it from diverging into non-serious humor?
Well, I think having the setting feel the right level of grit, that your mechanics follow said grit, that you're getting into. For instance, if you want it to feel challenging, if you want the world to feel challenging, in session 0 when you're talking with your players, let them know that their equipment is important. It's going to have ramifications on their abilities.
Yeah.
And that's part of the story is that, hey, you have these things, other people may not. Another thing is that if the game talks about its level of hit points and damage and things like Suede kind of does, where it's fun, fast, and, furious, is that you might say, like you did with us, was that this is going to change to a very dangerous situation, where your rolls have a very good chance of doing a lot of damage, but also so does the enemies. So you're going to take risks. And that setting that stage at a level where you're not necessarily talking about dark aspects, you're just talking about the mechanics of how things are going to flow, and then through session 0 in your descriptions, defining how the world is reflecting those rules in the same way, whether it be it's a war zone and there's limited things, or it's the frontier and there's limited things, those types of events, like you're in space. There isn't just a shop around the corner,
Yeah.
You've got to scrounge for resources on a regular basis to try and get what you need. That can sometimes change that feeling and that grit, and it doesn't mean that there can't be a sense of humor at times, but now you're not dealing with that same level of, you're creating the stress to start with, and the trauma starts coming even beforehand.
Yeah. I have two thoughts on this. The first, diverging into non-serious humor, I don't think it's as big of a problem as you think it is.
I don't think it will be.
Because first off, there's such a thing as gallows humor. And it is a valid trauma response to laugh at the thing that is threatening you.
Well, we saw it in Aliens, definitely. The movie, or Alien, where they kind of go into combat like a bunch of Marines do. We're just going to go solve the problem.
Oh, that's Aliens. Well, yeah, that's naivety. That's them not understanding what what I'm talking about is, I'm talking about like, you see, a dead body that's like maybe strung up in some weird and interesting way, but like, the poison that killed him from the giant spider that devoured him, made his face look funny, basically.
Yeah.
And you might laugh at that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he's making a funny face, because what else are you going to do? This is horrific.
Yeah.
But there's a part of your sanity that will grab onto that and go like, okay, it's not so bad, it's not so bad, it's not so bad. Here, look at his funny face.
Yeah.
Isn't that better than crying and screaming?
Right.
Here, laugh, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
But also, like, I think, to your first part of your question, how do you go about conveying this to your group? I like to do what I call throwing a warning shot.
Yeah.
And that is, if you want your PCs to understand that something is possible to happen to them, do it to an NPC first.
Yep.
And show them.
Yes.
If you want to show them that it is possible you will get eaten by a giant spider in this forest, show them an NPC that is strung up in a web and utterly, masticated by what's the word I'm looking at?
Desiccated?
Desiccated, thank you. All the insides sucked out of them.
Yep.
There you go.
Yep.
Now they go, oh crap, that could be us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Message sent.
Yeah. Yeah. There are owl bears in this forest. How do you know? There are pellets of bodies. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
right. Do it to an NPC first, and they will get the point.
Okay. Charles, that we actually had our interview with last week. Thank you again.
Who assisted us with our Stars Without Number.
Yes, has some questions.
Yeah.
Is body horror an important topic in pre-campaign discussion?
Absolutely.
System 0? 100%, without question.
Absolutely.
Without question. I think that any kind of parasitic infection or losing of limbs or growing of a second head should definitely 100% be discussed. I personally have an issue with body transformation. I have terrible nightmares about things growing, like crystals growing out of my body.
Ooh.
And I can think about it very clearly.
Oh god, I feel bad about the gibbering mouther now.
It wasn't nearly as bad because I could distance myself from that. Having 1,000 mouths or 1,000 eyes, no big deal. But if you tell me that my hand is literally growing 1,000,000 warts, I will get up and walk away from your table.
Oof.
So,
okay. Duly noted. Thank you.
Go.
I did not know that before now.
These are the things you discuss because sometimes you don't know to ask it. But I think that's is body horror thing is a great question to ask.
Yeah.
Is it good to incentivize torture in-game as a mechanical advantage for player characters? Always getting them the truth. God, no.
God, no.
God, no.
In fact, it's pretty well proven that torture
doesn't.
It doesn't actually get you the truth. Torture gets you any answer to stop the torture.
Correct.
Even if it's a confession of guilt that is completely false and made up, if I think that you want to hear I did it, I did the crime, and that's going to make you stop doing the thing that you're doing, then I will say that.
Yep. And the farther you get into torture, it is a proven fact that the person will side with you regardless of what you're saying versus themselves, because at that point, it's their body that's failing.
Yeah.
Not their mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does frequent player character death, regardless of system, discourage deep player character RP?
It does.
It definitely does.
And
Death is a finality.
One of the reasons why I think collectively as storytellers, you and I have oftentimes said things like, death is the end of the story, and, offer alternatives to death. And I know that's not I feel like that's an unpopular opinion. I feel like there's a lot of storytellers out there who feel like why bother rolling the dice? Why bother putting your characters in danger if you're not going to follow through on the danger?
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that story, but I think, or I understand that feeling, that impulse, but I think there's a happy medium to be met between kill them all, life is cheap, and never ever 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 kill a PC.
Yeah, there's a line in there.
There's definitely a happy medium to be met there, and if you're killing a PC off every game, you could maybe tone it back a little bit.
Yeah, and the other thing is, when we talk about character death, it's a finality of that character. It doesn't mean that you have to kill them. There's all kinds of ways to handle that.
Sure.
Ridiculous number of ways to handle that. And I handle it very differently in 7C, because I make always a rule that villains are the only things that can kill people, kill PCs. So it's that they may be severely injured, there may be another thing, they may have, complications, there may be all kinds of layers that go on top of it.
Sure.
So.
And keeping in mind, of course, that line moves with the story you're telling. We just got done talking about running gritty games where death is always on the table. Guess what? Death is always on the table.
Yeah.
You may not you may not want to kill your PCs all the time, but you certainly want to give them consequences to remind them that mortality is a factor in play here.
Yep.
Whereas something like 7C is not gritty. It's not even dark. It's kind of light and heroic and hopeful. It's swashbuckly.
Right, but when death does happen, whew.
It's very impactful
Very.
because it's such a rare and meaningful occurrence.
Yeah, yeah. I kind of want to jump to Hulavu's before answering the last one that's in that chain.
Okay, sure.
Hulavu asks, in settings that do not have gritty realism mechanics, how do you go about adding your own and keeping them balanced? First off, that last word right there, balanced, is stop it. Just stop trying to balance things and you'll feel much better about everything you're doing. But how do you add it and still keep the mechanics going? So there are lots of ways to add mechanical gritty realism that other games already have that are not part of their core mechanics. Mm-hmm. Alien has the stress dice.
Uh-huh. Yep.
What was the other one that I had referenced that was perfect?
Call of Cthulhu has sanity.
Yes, has sanity. There was another one that we had recently that had another stressor in it. I might have been Cyberpunk has another one that's in it. That involves a stress. But again, a lot of game systems have it as an add-on. And like I said, there's nothing to say that you can't grab something that someone homebrews, like I looked up with 5th edition, where critical hits do a permanent tick off of your constitution. Mm-hmm. Now granted, at another level, you could just raise your constitution and kind of subvert that, but that's a cost. So there's to decide what you're going to do with your gritty realism mechanics and add it into the game, you have to really think about what's the weight and cost to your players on their interval. For instance, if your gritty realism is survival and you decide to make their packs be what they have, like their equipment list is what they have, mm-hmm. and spell components are what they have, it's going to be a very crunchy game where they're making a lot of decisions all of the time. Where you're going to have that becomes now a survival mechanic game. And that may not be the direction you want to take. So you kind of have to decide what level of gritty realism you want to add in and have it be something that feels that it fits the theme.
Yeah, I think this is a bigger question than we have time to answer, simply because it's the answer for this one, at least for me, is going to be different depending on which system we're talking about.
Sure.
And there's countless systems without number out there. And so, I mean, how do you go about adding them to, I don't know, which game system? To D&D, right. To, White Wolf, to what are we talking about, what degree of gritty are we talking about? And I agree, balance is a crutch. Don't make them balanced. Like, it's not a game. I mean, it's a game, but like...
I'm just going to say this. You're going to realism. Balance is not real.
Yeah.
There's no balance.
Yes. Verisimilitude does not require balance, because life is not balanced.
Correct.
Not every challenge you meet in life is fair.
Yes. And sometimes that is man versus environment.
Yeah.
Sometimes
it just kicks your ass.
Sometimes the theme is just you're going to get your ass kicked a lot.
And you need to recalculate.
Yep.
Because this is not a fight you can win.
Correct.
But I think, at least my initial impulse here is to say, if the game system that you are using mm-hmm. does not fit the tone and does not have the rules for adjudicating the things that you want, my initial impulse is find another system.
Yeah.
There are systems without number out there. You can find a system, I think, that better fits the feel and tone and pace
just ask.
Of your game.
Somebody's already ran it. Somebody's already felt it. Someone's already complained about it.
Yeah.
Like, this game just feels too real. Go on.
Like, I consider myself pretty well versed in dozens of different, role-playing systems. I mean, we've made a show out of it. This is episode 146. But I dipped into a thread on Reddit the other day in the RPG subreddit. Mm-hmm. And it was like, what's the game you love to hate, or something mm-hmm. like that. And in just the first 10 comments, I heard 12 different systems I'd never heard of before.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I think we've hit a lot of the major ones, but my God,
I love when someone lists a system and there's 13 comics. Oh yeah, I haven't played that in so long, and blah blah blah. And you're like, so long?
So long? How long? What is this?
How are 40 people talking about this? Yeah. So then we just go digging.
I've been playing role playing games for 25 years. How have I never heard of this?
Yeah.
But there's that many systems out there. That's why.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So I mean. I know, and of course, I realize that not every game group is going to be like, yeah, let's just jump to a new system. Let's learn a whole new thing, even though I just spent $100 on D&D books, you know?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to feel obligated due to the sunk cost fallacy to use those D&D books that you did, so now we're going to homebrew D&D to turn into gritty realism, you know? I get that, but like I said, my initial impulse is try to find something that does fit it rather than homebrewing a bunch of stuff to fundamentally change the foundation of a game system that was never meant to tell that type of story.
Exactly. All right. You want to grab Overwatches?
Yeah. So Overwatch asks, gritty and violent can be a wide spectrum. Anything from film noir into the grim, dark future there is only death. How do you recommend finding the sweet spot to suit your particular campaign, system, and table?
I
mean, I don't know. What's your campaign, system, and table? It feels like every table is going to be different, and a lot of that is going to be communication.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that is going to be knowing your players.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that is, between knowing your players initially and just knowing what they're going to like and not like.
Yeah.
And communicating with your players that this is my intended tone and feel.
Mm-hmm.
How do you guys feel about that?
Yeah, and I would be prepared to be able to shift all of that.
Yeah.
I often question my players. If I've got an idea for a story, I will throw a quiz at them and be like, hey, this is the kind of feel. Is this the type of story and this level of realism and this level of stuff? Does that fit with what you guys would think? And are you interested in playing this? And at that point, you can start either catering players to play the game that you want to run, or you can find out what your table would like to play.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the real key there, is that if you think you're going to add grit to something, that's something to say. But if you have a vague idea of a story that you want to run and a kind of theme and feel that you want to go for, are you catering it to the players, or are you going to find players who want to play that game?
Yeah, yeah.
And that's the two feelings of any storyteller.
Yeah, are you telling a story for them, or are you telling a story for you?
Well, or are you finding people you want to tell that story with?
Well, no, I mean, that's fine. It's fine to tell a story for you. If that's the story you want to tell, you've got a good idea, you want to tell that story, absolutely.
Yeah.
You just want to make sure that you have people at your table who want to hear that story, that's all.
Yeah. Okay, I want to get into some final thoughts, so we can close this up.
Sure.
So one of the things that came up during a discussion, was, when we were prepping for this, was, you had said a word that triggered a line in my brain. From a song, in fact.
Yeah.
In fact, I went immediately, you said, everybody knows. And I don't remember what the context was at the time, but I wrote it down really quick, because I remembered the song, Everybody Knows, by Concrete Blonde. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the lyrics, it's not that important. But the concept that it rung in my head is why is this song important right now? Why did this trigger, in my brain? Mm-hmm. And that is that in most gritty worlds, the difference in my mind frame between a gritty world that is very realistic and has violence and things like that have that level in it, is that everyone is aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
It is not a fantasy realm where they're living their lives normally, and everything kind of keeps going until something pokes their bubble.
Yeah.
The goblins attack. There's a villain doing something terrible in town, murdering people. A necromancer's doing something, and they hear about people going missing.
Mm-hmm.
That level of naivety that you have in fantasy is gone. Because even the street urchins know that it's bad. Yeah. And that 5 gold pieces you just gave them is not the greatest thing in the world. It might buy them something, but in more cases than not, it's going to get their butt kicked.
Yeah.
And stolen from them.
Thanks. Now I'm the rich person that's
exactly.
going to get shivved.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the one of the differences is that if you could take anything, at least from me, is that when you want to get to a level of realism, is that when your NPCs talk to your PCs, they might not know all the details, but they know the truth of the world. Mm-hmm. And it's written in their faces, and in their clothes, and in their shops, and in their mannerisms, whether it's exhaustion, trauma, sadness, just they got a glimpse beyond the veil of fantasy into reality just like the players have. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it sucks. They know. Everybody knows. And that's what hit my head. I'm like, oh God. Okay, there we go. Now I remember how to run Grit.
Yep.
And I'm sad.
You just listen to Everybody Knows by Concrete Blonde, or Leonard Cohen, I believe, is the version I know.
Google's keelhauling and instant regret.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Hula-hoo, yes. When your entire crew knows what that word means.
Yep.
That's the grit of being on a pirate ship versus being in a heroic pirate ship.
Knox in the Box mentioned it earlier in the live chat. He says, where did he say
Yeah.
it?
As a kid, keel hauling sounds like a fun and silly word.
word.
In adulthood, good lord. Yeah, because you know. And it's hard to not know.
Yep.
And, I mean, that's grit. That's the truth of it. It's that it can make a story feel challenging and framed and tense instead of being a murder spree without consequence. Mm-hmm. You know, violence has an impact and should be used as an impact because you could describe the sudden and quick death of something in a way that has an impact on everyone. Mm-hmm. Or you can show the long, languid moments after. You know, months, years after in some cases, and still feel that same energy. You know, I'm always brought back to shots from Indiana Jones where he finds a skull with where a trap has pinned it.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh God, that could be me.
This is environmental storytelling.
Yeah.
Yep.
But that's part of violence. That's showing violence and realism. And when they do work together, where you might have limited ammo or strength, or your hero's fragile and the monsters are literally tearing the world apart, it's hard to ignore that they're monsters at that point. You know, I think back to when we fought the troll in town.
In my game, yeah.
In your game. And thinking, like, we're not invincible. And then the one, I'm going to say idiot, decides that he's not invincible, that he is invincible because he can handle it.
Yeah.
And he could not. Like, shit got real.
Yeah, it did.
That's gritty realism at its best. Like, you painted all of the pictures. It was there, without a doubt. And I was like, there's nothing I have in my repertoire that's gonna drop this thing. But there's fire, and fire hurts everyone.
Yes. It's like one of my favorite YouTubers said, you never grow accustomed to being set on fire.
Exactly. So.
All right. You want to wrap this up then?
I want to close with one other thought.
Sure.
And it's the question that came up that I passed, and that was, how does one assess the difference between fun strain and frustrating strain in endurance-focused campaigns or arcs? And that's the one thing we haven't really discussed is that one of the ways of grit kind of pushes endurance, the player's endurance.
Sure.
How do you balance that? What metric do you use?
So, if I were running such a campaign, my big thing would be a wish and a star.
Yeah.
A rose and a thorn.
Yep, that's right at the end of every session.
Tell me a thing that you liked about my session. Tell me a thing that I could have done better about your session. And be honest with me.
Yeah.
I am asking you this question so I can improve as a storyteller, so I can make my sessions better and more fun for you as a player. I'm not looking for a pat on the back like, oh no, everything was great.
Yeah.
If you are exhausted at the end of my game session because you feel like the survival stuff is too grueling and it's too gritty and you're just stressed out by my game and you're not having fun, tell me this so I can make adjustments.
Yeah.
And that to me, it's just how do you assess the difference? ask.
Always ask. Get good feedback. And don't ask generalized questions of, did you like things? If your players are not answering specifically. Mm-hmm. Like, if you think that your metrics are off, that you're pushing hard, ask, hey, this thing that I added to add gritty realism, how do you guys enjoy that?
Yeah, exactly. I used X, Y, or Z mechanic here.
Yeah.
How did that affect you? How did you feel that played in the game?
Was it good for the story? Was it bad for the story?
Did it move fast enough? Do you find it tiring to have to keep these things? Do you think I could simplify this in any way?
Right.
Or would you like me to keep going with this? Do you think it was not enough? Should I add more?
Yep.
You know?
Perfect.
So, alright. Next week's topic, we are going to be talking about the child adventure genre. So things like Stranger Things, kids on bikes, things like that. So you can find us on Twitter at @ST_Conclave, on Instagram at @ST_Conclave. Listen to us live every Wednesday night, 7 p.m. Eastern Time on mixlr.com/storyteller-conclave. And join us up on our Discord. There's a lot of great discussion there lately.
We did. It was wonderful.
And you can find that link on our Twitter as well as our website, storytellerconclave.com.
Some new members to our Discord. Charles joined, and Vanillasaur and Dieselnowski. Thank you so much for joining. If you want to join our live chats during the show, join our Patreon. And some of our, even at the base level, you'll get access to that. But if you'd like to join a little higher, you get to have your names listed, like Nox and Sam and the Arcane Asylum, Sparkle Motion, Vedran, and Hulavu. We really appreciate all your help every single month. Our pre-show music is by Arcane Anthems. You can find that at patreon.com/arcaneanthems. Our intro music is Beyond the Warriors by Geefrog. You can find that at geefrog.bandcamp.com or on Google Music. And our outro music, which you're hearing right now, is Only Our Footprints in the Sand by Midair Machine.
And big shout as always to our families, Vicky and Sean. We love you so much. All of our friends who we have traumatized over the years with our violent acts, and you, every single one of our listeners. We love you so much.
Love you very much.
Good night.
Good night.